The morning sun filtered through the windows of Joe's Diner, casting a warm glow across the well-worn countertops and vinyl booths. It was early, just past 7, and the smell of fresh coffee and sizzling bacon filled the air. This little diner, tucked away in a quiet corner of San Diego, had been serving the local community for over 30 years. Among the usual morning crowd sat a customer in a wheelchair near the window. He was a retired Navy SEAL, though none of the other patrons knew that. Most just saw what they wanted to see, a disabled black man having his breakfast alone. But there was so much more to his story than met the eye. 15 years of distinguished military service had shaped him into one of the most highly trained warriors in the world. The wheelchair he now used wasn't a symbol of weakness, but rather a testament to his sacrifice during his final mission. His injury might have changed how he moved through the world, but it hadn't diminished his spirit or capabilities one bit. As he sipped his coffee and scanned the morning newspaper, the familiar bustle of the diner played out around him. The clank of plates, friendly chatter of regulars, and calls of "order up" created a comfortable backdrop to his morning routine. Rose, the veteran waitress who'd been working there for 2 decades, stopped by his table with a fresh cup of coffee. She didn't need to ask if he wanted a refill anymore. Other customers came and went, some stealing curious glances his way, others barely noticing him at all. A young family at a nearby booth watched uncertainly as he maneuvered his wheelchair with practiced ease. Their little boy, no more than 5, stared openly with the innocent curiosity of childhood until his mother gently shushed him. The retired SEAL didn't mind the attention. He'd grown used to it over the years. His military training had taught him to stay aware of his surroundings, and he noticed everything. The suspicious looks, the awkward avoidance, the occasional whispers. But he also noticed the respect in Rose's eyes when she served him, the friendly nod from the short-order cook, and the way the diner's owner would sometimes stop by just to chat about the weather. This morning was special, though. It marked exactly 1 year since he first wheeled himself through the diner's doors. Back then, he'd been searching for a quiet place where he could ease back into civilian life. The diner, with its unpretentious charm and down-to-earth patrons, had become something of a sanctuary. He folded his newspaper and placed it neatly beside his half-finished plate of eggs and toast. The morning crowd was starting to thin out as the workday began. Through the large front windows, he could see people hurrying past on their way to offices and shops, each wrapped up in their own daily routines. Little did anyone know that this ordinary morning was about to become extraordinary. As he checked his watch and considered ordering another coffee, the bell above the diner's door chimed. The peaceful atmosphere was about to change dramatically, though none of the breakfast patrons could have predicted just how much. The retired SEAL noticed the shift in energy immediately. Years of training had honed his instincts to razor sharpness. His hand paused mid-reach for his coffee cup as 3 large shadows fell across the checkered floor. The diner's usual morning chatter quieted to a tense hush, and the air grew thick with unspoken tension. 3 bikers had just walked in, their heavy boots thudding against the linoleum floor. They weren't the friendly weekend riders who sometimes stopped by for breakfast. These men carried an aura of trouble with them like a dark cloud. The retired SEAL remained perfectly still, his face betraying nothing of his thoughts as he carefully assessed the situation. What happened next would become a story told and retold throughout the community for years to come. But for now, it was just another morning at Joe's Diner, or at least, that's what it seemed to be. The 3 bikers who entered Joe's Diner that morning weren't just any troublemakers, they were well known in the area, and not for good reasons. Their leather vests were covered with patches that told stories of rides across the country, but lately they'd been telling different kinds of stories around town. Stories about businesses paying for protection, about customers feeling unwelcome, about a neighborhood changing for the worse. The leader stood well over 6 feet tall, with arms thick as tree trunks and a beard that hadn't seen a trim in years. His 2 companions weren't much smaller, and all 3 carried themselves with the swagger of men used to getting their way. The bell above the door was still swinging when the diner fell quiet enough to hear a fork drop. Rose, the veteran waitress, froze mid-pour at the counter, coffee pot hovering above a customer's cup. The short-order cook stopped flipping pancakes, his spatula suspended in mid-air. Even the little boy who'd been fascinated by the man in the wheelchair earlier now pressed closer to his mother, sensing the shift in the atmosphere. The bikers took their time surveying the diner, like wolves sizing up a flock. Their heavy boots scraped against the linoleum floor as they moved between the tables, making more noise than necessary. A young couple quickly paid their bill and slipped out, leaving their breakfast half-finished. The elderly man at the counter suddenly became very interested in his scrambled eggs. The retired SEAL remained perfectly still at his table by the window, his newspaper folded neatly beside his cooling coffee. He'd seen their type before, bullies who mistook kindness for weakness, who fed off fear like it was fuel. His training had taught him to observe first, act second, and he watched their reflection in the window as they made their way through the diner. It didn't take long for them to notice him. The leader nudged one of his companions, jerking his chin toward the wheelchair. A grin spread across his face, the kind that never reaches the eyes. They'd been looking for entertainment, and in their minds, they just found it. The trio approached his table, their shadows falling across his breakfast plate. The leader planted his hands on the table, leaning down to eye level with the seated man. His breath smelled of stale cigarettes and bad intentions. Behind him, his companions spread out slightly, blocking any easy exit route, a tactic the retired SEAL recognized all too well. "Nice wheels," the leader said, his voice carrying across the now silent diner. He reached out and tapped the wheelchair's armrest with thick fingers. "Must be tough, getting around like that." The false sympathy in his voice couldn't mask the mockery underneath. The retired SEAL took a slow sip of his coffee, his movements deliberate and unhurried. His calm seemed to irritate the bikers even more. They were used to people cowering, to voices shaking and eyes lowering. This wasn't the reaction they'd expected. Other customers watched the scene unfold through lowered eyes, their bodies tense with the anticipation of violence. A young waitress had her phone in her hand beneath her apron, thumb hovering over the keypad. The cook had moved closer to the counter's edge, gripping his spatula like it might make a difference. The leader straightened up, exchanging looks with his companions. This was usually the part where people broke, where they offered money or apologies, or whatever else might make the bikers move along. But the man in the wheelchair simply set his coffee cup down and folded his hands in his lap, his face a mask of complete composure. What the bikers couldn't know, was that they'd just made the biggest mistake of their lives. They saw a target, but they were looking at a highly trained warrior who had faced down threats far worse than 3 overconfident bullies in a small-town diner. The air in the diner grew thick with tension as the moment stretched out like a rubber band pulled too tight. Everyone could feel it was about to snap. They just didn't know how. The morning sun continued to stream through the windows, creating long shadows that seemed to reach across the floor like fingers of fate, pointing toward what was about to unfold. The next few moments in Joe's diner unfolded like a scene from an old Western movie, where the whole room holds its breath before the storm breaks. The biker gang leader took another step closer, his heavy boots scuffing against the floor in a way that made several customers wince. "You know," he drawled, voice dripping with false concern, "we've been hearing this place isn't very friendly to certain folks." He gestured vaguely around the diner. "Been thinking maybe we should start providing some community service. Make sure everyone feels welcome." His lips curved into what might have been a smile, but his eyes remained cold as winter. The retired SEAL looked up slowly, his gaze steady and unflinching. Years of combat training had taught him to read people like books, and these 3 were an open chapter of bad intentions. He could see the youngest biker's hand trembling slightly, a sign of nervousness masked as aggression. The second one kept shifting his weight from foot to foot, unable to stand still. Only the leader held his ground with genuine confidence, though it was the misplaced confidence of someone who'd never faced a real challenge. "Gentlemen," the retired SEAL said, his voice calm and measured, carrying the quiet authority of someone who had commanded men in battle. "I suggest you walk away now." Each word was clear and precise, like individual stones dropping into still water. His response caught them off guard. They'd expected fear, maybe pleading, or even anger, but not this tranquil self-assurance. The leader's face reddened slightly, his carefully constructed intimidation routine crumbling in the face of such composure. Around the diner, the morning crowd watched the scene unfold with a mixture of dread and fascination. The cook had quietly moved a large cast iron pan within easy reach. Rose, the veteran waitress, stood near the phone, her fingers resting on the receiver. The young family from earlier had managed to slip out quietly, the mother clutching her child close as they hurried to their car. The biker leader leaned down again, this time close enough that his beard nearly brushed the retired SEAL's shoulder. "Maybe you didn't hear me right," he growled. "See, we're offering protection here. Insurance, you might say. And right now, you're sitting at our table." The retired SEAL didn't lean back or flinch away. Instead, he maintained eye contact with the kind of steadiness that comes from having stared down far worse threats in far darker places. His hands remained relaxed on the wheelchair's armrests, but anyone watching closely might have noticed how his shoulders settled into a supple, ready position. "I heard you perfectly," he replied, his voice still calm but carrying an edge of steel now. "And I'll say this one more time, walk away." The words hung in the air like thunder before lightning. The other customers in the diner had gone completely still. Someone's coffee cup clinked against its saucer, the sound sharp as a gunshot in the tense silence. Through the window, the morning sun cast long shadows across the checkered floor, like nature itself was holding its breath. The leader straightened up, his face twisted with anger and wounded pride. He looked at his companions, jerking his head in a silent command. They moved closer, forming a tighter circle around the wheelchair. The youngest one cracked his knuckles, a nervous habit rather than a threat, but the sound echoed in the quiet diner like breaking glass. What none of them realized was that every move they made was being calculated and analyzed by a mind trained in combat tactics. The retired SEAL noted their positions, their stances, their patterns of movement. He saw how the leader favored his right side slightly, how the nervous one kept his weight too far forward, how the third man's breathing had quickened with anticipation. The next few seconds would change everything, not just for these three bikers, but for everyone in Joe's diner that morning. The retired SEAL took one last sip of his coffee, setting the cup down with deliberate care. His movements were smooth and unhurried, like a man who had all the time in the world. The breaking point came not with a shout or a crash, but with a quiet scrape of boots on linoleum. The biker leader, his patience worn thin by the retired SEAL's calm demeanor, made his move. His hands reached for the wheelchair's handles, intending to tip it backward. It was the kind of cruel trick he used before to establish dominance. But this time, things would go very differently. Time seemed to slow down in Joe's diner. The morning sunlight streaming through the windows caught dust motes in the air, making them dance like tiny stars. The cook's spatula clattered to the grill, forgotten. Rosa's hand tightened on the phone receiver, her knuckles white with tension. The retired SEAL had been waiting for this moment. 15 years of elite military training had taught him that the best defense often came from appearing vulnerable. As the leader's hands touched the wheelchair, several things happened almost simultaneously. With a fluid motion that spoke of countless hours of training, the retired SEAL's hands moved from his lap. His upper body, hardened by years of adapting to life in a wheelchair, responded with the precision of a well-oiled machine. The leader's aggressive momentum suddenly worked against him, his confident smirk transforming into wide-eyed surprise. The younger biker lunged forward to help his boss, but his eagerness made him clumsy. The retired SEAL's movements were economical, almost gentle, like a teacher showing a student proper form. In seconds, the younger man found himself wondering how he ended up sitting on the floor, his world spinning slightly. The third biker, who had been hanging back, now faced a choice. The smart decision would have been to walk away. Instead, he chose to follow his friend's example and quickly learned why that was a mistake. The retired SEAL's hands moved with surgical precision, finding pressure points that required minimal force but maximum effect. Throughout it all, not a single coffee cup was knocked over. No furniture was broken. The retired SEAL hadn't even needed to raise his voice. His breathing remained steady and controlled, like he was simply going through a morning exercise routine. The diner's other customers watched in amazement as the scene unfolded. A trucker at the counter quietly pulled out his phone, recording the last few seconds. The cook stood frozen, his mouth slightly open, a forgotten order growing cold on the grill behind him. The leader of the biker gang, who had started this confrontation with such confidence, now found himself in an unexpectedly humble position. His face pressed against the cool linoleum floor, his arm held in a gentle but immovable grip that somehow made it impossible to do anything but stay still. You see, the retired SEAL spoke softly, his voice carrying in the silent diner. There's a difference between being disabled and being helpless. He adjusted his hold slightly, ensuring no actual harm would come to his opponent. I tried to give you a choice. The morning sun continued to stream through the windows, illuminating the scene like a spotlight on a stage. The three bikers who had swaggered in with such misplaced confidence were now getting a lesson in humility they wouldn't soon forget. Rose had already dialed the police, speaking quietly into the phone. The cook had finally remembered his duties and was hurriedly removing burnt pancakes from the grill. A few of the regular customers exchanged knowing looks. They'd always sensed there was more to the quiet man in the wheelchair than met the eye. The retired SEAL maintained his calm demeanor throughout the entire incident. His actions spoke of years of training in control rather than aggression, in neutralizing threats rather than causing harm. It was a masterclass in defensive techniques, performed with the precision of someone who understood exactly how much force was necessary, and more importantly, how much wasn't. What had started as an attempt at intimidation had transformed into a profound lesson about assumptions and appearances. The morning light caught the retired SEAL's face, highlighting the quiet dignity in his expression. He wasn't angry or vengeful. If anything, he seemed almost sorry that things had needed to escalate at all. The aftermath of those 30 seconds in Joe's diner felt like waking up from a shared dream. The three bikers were scattered across the floor, looking dazed and confused, while the man in the wheelchair calmly straightened his shirt. The entire scene had played out so quickly that some customers were still trying to process what they'd witnessed. The young waitress, who had been frozen behind the counter during the confrontation, suddenly gasped. Her hands flew to her mouth as recognition dawned in her eyes. "I know who you are," she whispered, but in the quiet diner, her words carried clearly. "You were at the Veterans Ceremony last month. You're one of them. The Navy SEALs." A murmur rippled through the diner as other customers began connecting the dots. The calm demeanor, the precise movements, the incredible control, it all made sense now. The man they'd seen as just another disabled veteran was actually one of the most highly trained warriors in the world. The biker leader, still on the floor, turned his head to stare at the retired SEAL with new understanding. The color drained from his face as he realized exactly who he'd tried to intimidate. His earlier bravado had evaporated like morning dew in the sun. 20 years ago, the retired SEAL spoke, his voice carrying easily in the hushed diner. "I made a promise to defend this country and its people. That promise didn't end when I left active duty." He wheeled himself back slightly, giving the bikers space to get up. "The wheelchair doesn't change who I am or what I stand for." Through the large diner windows, red and blue lights began to flash as police cars pulled into the parking lot. The morning sun caught their rotating lights, sending colorful patterns dancing across the walls. Several officers entered, their hands resting cautiously on their belts, but they quickly realized the situation was already under control. One of the officers, an older man with salt and pepper hair, took in the scene and broke into a knowing smile. He'd served in the military himself, and he recognized the telltale signs of special operations training. The way the retired SEAL had handled the situation, minimal force, maximum efficiency, no collateral damage, was a hallmark of elite training. The cook emerged from behind his grill, shaking his head in amazement. "All this time," he said, flipping a perfectly golden pancake, "you've been coming in here, eating my cooking, and we never knew. Never even suspected." There was respect in his voice, but also a touch of awe. Rose, the veteran waitress, walked over with a fresh pot of coffee. Her hands were steady as she refilled the retired SEAL's cup, but her eyes were bright with unshed tears. "My son," she said softly, "he served too. Different branch, but thank you. Just thank you." The other customers in the diner had begun to relax, though many were still stealing glances at the retired SEAL. A businessman in a crisp suit stood up and walked over to the counter, quietly paying for everyone's breakfast. It was a small gesture, but it spoke volumes about the impact of what they'd witnessed. The young waitress who had recognized him was now telling the officers about the veterans ceremony where she'd first seen him. How he'd been honored for his service, for missions that would never be declassified, for sacrifices that would never make the headlines. The retired SEAL listened with characteristic modesty, neither confirming nor denying her words. Outside, the morning had continued as if nothing extraordinary had happened. Cars passed by, people walked their dogs, and the world spun on. But inside Joe's diner, something had shifted. The regular customers who had always seen him as just another disabled veteran now saw the warrior beneath the wheelchair. The strength that had always been there, hidden in plain sight. As the police began taking statements, the retired SEAL remained at his table, sipping his fresh coffee. His newspaper lay forgotten beside his plate, but he didn't seem to mind. The morning sun streamed through the windows, casting a golden light that seemed to highlight the quiet dignity in his bearing. The police officers handled the situation at Joe's diner with a mix of professionalism and respect. The older officer, a former Marine himself, knelt down beside the retired SEAL's wheelchair to take his statement. His notebook remained closed as they spoke quietly, sharing the unspoken understanding that comes from years of service. "Sir," the officer said, his voice carrying the weight of experience, "we've been trying to catch these guys for weeks. They've been terrorizing small businesses all over town." He shook his head, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Never thought it would end like this." The three bikers, now thoroughly subdued, sat in plastic chairs near the counter while another officer took their statements. The leader couldn't meet anyone's eyes, his earlier bravado replaced by the shame of someone who'd just learned a very public lesson about judging books by their covers. Through the diner's windows, a small crowd had gathered. Word spreads fast in a small town, and the story of what had happened was already making its way through the community. Some people took pictures with their phones, while others just watched, curious about the police presence at their favorite breakfast spot. The cook had recovered his composure and was back at his grill, though he kept glancing over at the scene with a mix of pride and amazement. He'd already decided that his signature breakfast special would be renamed in honor of their regular customer, though he'd have to ask permission first, of course. Rose, the veteran waitress, had called her son during her break. Her voice shook slightly as she told him about what had happened, about how it reminded her of his own service, about how some people never stop protecting others even after they leave the military. Her son, stationed halfway across the country, listened intently and promised to visit soon. The young businessman who had paid everyone's bills turned out to be a local shop owner. He stepped forward as the police were finishing up, clearing his throat nervously. "Those men," he said, gesturing toward the bikers, "they came to my store last week. Threatened to break my windows if I didn't pay them protection money." He straightened his tie, standing a little taller. "I was too scared to report it, but not anymore." Other business owners began coming forward throughout the morning. A flower shop owner from down the street, the elderly couple who ran the bookstore, the owner of the local pharmacy, each had their own story about the bikers' intimidation tactics. What had started as a simple breakfast had turned into something much bigger, a community finally finding its courage to stand up against bullies. The retired SEAL listened to each story with patience and understanding. He didn't seek attention or praise, but his presence had become a catalyst for change. When a local reporter showed up, notepad in hand, he politely declined to be interviewed. "This isn't about me," he said quietly. "It's about doing what's right." The police found more evidence in the bikers' belongings, records of their extortion scheme, lists of targeted businesses, even stolen property. What had seemed like a simple case of harassment was unfolding into something much larger. The officer in charge couldn't help but smile at the irony, all their investigative work, and it took a quiet morning at a diner to break the case wide open. Throughout it all, the morning sun continued to climb higher in the sky, sending warm shafts of light through the diner's windows. The regular breakfast crowd had thinned out, replaced by curious onlookers and supportive community members. Someone had brought coffee and donuts for the police officers, turning the scene of confrontation into something almost festive. The retired SEAL remained at his table, occasionally sipping his coffee, watching as the ripples of his actions spread through the community. He hadn't sought this attention or recognition. He'd simply done what he'd been trained to do: protect those who needed protection, stand up against intimidation, and handle the situation with precision and control. In the days that followed the incident at Joe's diner, the story spread through the community like wildfire. What had started as a simple breakfast had transformed into something much more meaningful, a reminder that courage comes in many forms, and that appearances can be deceiving. The diner itself had become something of a local landmark. People would point it out to visitors, telling them about the morning when three tough-looking bikers learned an unforgettable lesson about judging others. The booth by the window, where the retired SEAL always sat, had unofficially become the most requested seat in the house. 1 week after the incident, the local business association held a meeting at the diner. The place was packed with shop owners, residents, and even a few curious visitors from neighboring towns. They gathered to discuss how to make their community safer, stronger, and more inclusive. The retired SEAL sat quietly in his usual spot, listening as people shared their stories and ideas. The cook had outdone himself that morning, preparing a special breakfast menu that included what he now called the Defender's Special, a hearty plate of eggs, hash browns, and toast arranged with military precision. He'd asked the retired SEAL's permission first, of course, and donated part of the proceeds to the local Veterans Support Center. Rose, the veteran waitress, noticed how different the atmosphere felt now. Regular customers greeted each other more warmly, paid more attention to their neighbors, and seemed more willing to help one another. The diner had always been a community gathering place, but now it felt more like a family room than just a restaurant. The biker gang's influence in the area had completely dissolved. 2 of the younger members had actually returned to the diner, not to cause trouble, but to apologize. They sat at the counter, caps in hands, and spoke quietly with the retired SEAL about turning their lives around. He listened without judgment, offering advice about discipline, respect, and finding purpose in life. Local veterans began stopping by more frequently, drawn by the story but staying for companionship. They didn't all sit together or make a show of their service. Some just nodded respectfully as they passed the window booth, understanding the quiet strength it represented. The retired SEAL welcomed them all, sharing coffee and conversation with fellow servicemen and women who understood what it meant to serve something greater than themselves. A small veterans support group started meeting at the diner every Thursday morning. They chose the early hours when the place was quietest, sharing stories and supporting each other through the challenges of civilian life. The retired SEAL attended when he could, not as a leader but as an equal, someone who understood both the pride of service and the cost it sometimes carried. The incident had also sparked conversations about accessibility in the community. Business owners began looking at their shops with new eyes, considering how to make them more welcoming to everyone. The hardware store installed a ramp, the bookshop widened its aisles, and other businesses followed suit. What had started as a response to one man's dignity had grown into a movement for inclusive change. Children in the neighborhood began to see the world differently too. Parents overheard them playing games where the hero was someone in a wheelchair, teaching bullies a lesson about respect. The local elementary school invited the retired SEAL to speak about service, courage, and the importance of looking beyond surface appearances. He kept his talk simple and honest, focusing on values rather than violence. Even the diner itself had changed in subtle ways. The owner installed better lighting, added some patriotic decorations, and put up a small plaque that read, "All who enter here are welcome." It wasn't dedicated to anyone specifically, but everyone knew what had inspired it. The retired SEAL continued his morning routine, arriving early for breakfast and reading his paper by the window. He remained the same quiet, dignified presence he'd always been, neither seeking attention nor avoiding it. But now, when he looked around the diner, he saw more than just a place to eat breakfast. He saw a community that had learned to look past appearances and stand up for what was right. As the morning sun streamed through the windows of Joe's Diner, casting its warm glow across the checkered floor, it illuminated more than just tables and chairs. It shone on a community transformed by a simple act of courage, reminding everyone that true strength isn't about physical power or intimidation. It's about standing up for what's right, protecting others, and bringing out the best in your community.